Sometimes the biggest mistakes in life turn out to be unexpected blessings. We've all felt the sting of being laughed at for something that seemed foolish at the time. Silas Soggy Bottoms just spent his last $25 on a deed to worthless Swampland. The whole town thinks he's lost his mind. But when he rides out to inspect the property, he finds two wild donkeys fighting violently in knee-deep water. As he breaks up their brawl, Silas sees something that changes everything. The water isn't muddy, it's thick with black crude oil. His useless swamp sits on a fortune. But can one broke cowboy keep his discovery when the corrupt banker who sold it realizes what he's done? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Golden Spur Saloon smelled like it always did: tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, and the peculiar musk of men who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. Silas Bottoms sat alone at a corner table, nursing what remained of his last dollar's worth of rotgut. The deed lay before him, wrinkled and stained with a ring from his glass. In the dim lamplight, the ornate script seemed to mock him. Mosquito Creek, Section 47, 20 acres more or less. More or less. That phrase had done plenty of work over the years, covering a multitude of sins in land deals across the West. He was 53 years old, though his weathered face and the deep lines around his eyes made him look older. 3 decades of cowboying had left their mark a limp from a horse that threw him in Abilene, scars on his hands from rope burns and barbed wire, and a perpetual squint from too many years staring into the sun. His given name was Silas, but folks had called him Soggy since that unfortunate incident with the herd crossing at Devil's Fork when he'd lost his footing and spent 3 days pulling cattle from quicksand. Some nicknames stick whether you want them to or not. The saloon was filling up with the usual evening crowd. Cowhands from the nearby ranches, a few prospectors who'd come down from the hills with nothing to show for their efforts, and the merchants who kept redemption alive despite its best efforts to die. It was 1893, and towns like this one teetered on the edge of existence, held together by stubborn hope and the railroad that passed through twice a week. "Well, if it ain't the land baron himself," came a voice from the bar. Silas didn't need to look up to know it was Chet Drummond, a ranch hand who'd never met a man he couldn't needle. "Tell us, Soggy, you planning to build yourself a mansion out there in the marsh? Maybe plant some rice?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Silas took another sip of his drink and said nothing. He'd learned long ago that responding only encouraged men like Chet. "I heard he paid cash money for it," another voice chimed in. This one belonged to Pete Halloran, who worked at the feed store. $25 for land that ain't good for nothing but mosquitoes and mud turtles. "Hell, I wouldn't give you 2 bits for it." "That's 2 bits more than it's worth," Chet said, and the laughter grew louder. Silas folded the deed carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket. His hands, he noticed, were steadier than he'd expected. Maybe it was the whiskey, or maybe it was something else, a quiet certainty that had settled over him in the 3 hours since he'd walked out of Thaddeus Cordell's office with that piece of paper. Thaddeus Cordell. Now there was a man who bore thinking about. Cordell owned the Redemption Savings and Trust, which was a grand name for what amounted to a desk, a safe, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd arrived in town 5 years earlier with a carpet bag full of money and an air of Eastern sophistication that impressed the locals. He wore tailored suits, kept his mustache waxed to fine points, and spoke with the kind of vocabulary that made simple folk feel simple. But Silas had been around long enough to recognize a snake when he saw one, even if it wore a good suit. 3 months ago, Silas had come to Cordell looking for a loan. His sister's husband had died suddenly, leaving her with 3 children and a failing farm outside of Laramie. She needed $500 to make it through the winter, and Silas had exactly nothing to offer except his labor and his word. Cordell had smiled that cold smile and explained, with great patience, that the bank couldn't extend credit to a man with no collateral, no property, and no prospects. "Perhaps if you owned land," Cordell had said, adjusting his spectacles, "we might discuss terms, but a cowboy's promise, I'm afraid, holds little weight in financial matters." The words had stung because they were true. Silas had spent 30 years working other men's cattle, sleeping in other men's bunkhouses, and riding other men's horses. He'd saved nothing, owned nothing, and built nothing. He'd told himself it was freedom, but at 53, freedom was starting to look a lot like foolishness. So when he'd seen the notice in Cordell's window this morning, land for sale, immediate purchase, something had stirred in him. $25. He had exactly $27.15 to his name, saved from 6 months of work at the Double R Ranch. It was meant for winter clothes and a new saddle, but standing there in the morning sun, looking at that notice, Silas had made a decision that surprised even himself. "I'd like to purchase that land," he told Cordell when he walked into the bank. Cordell had looked up from his ledger, his expression shifting through several stages of surprise before settling on something that might have been amusement. "The Mosquito Creek property? Mr. Bottoms, I feel obligated to inform you that this land is, shall we say, of limited utility. It's marshland, prone to flooding, infested with insects, and entirely unsuitable for cattle, crops, or habitation. I understand that. The previous owner defaulted on a loan. I'm selling it merely to recover the outstanding debt. I would hate for you to make an unwise investment." But Silas had heard something in Cordell's voice, a note of eagerness beneath the veneer of concern. The banker wanted to sell this land, and he wanted to sell it quickly. That alone was interesting. $25, Silas had said, placing the money on Cordell's desk. Cash. For just a moment, something had flickered across Cordell's face. Not quite greed, not quite triumph, but something close to both. Then the professional mask had slipped back into place, and he'd drawn up the deed with efficient precision. "I commend your entrepreneurial spirit," Cordell had said as he pressed his seal into the wax. "Though I confess I cannot imagine what use you'll find for such property." Neither could Silas, if he was being honest. But he'd learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that when a snake like Thaddeus Cordell worked too hard to talk you out of something, it was worth looking at twice. Now, sitting in the Golden Spur with the deed in his pocket and the laughter of his peers in his ears, Silas wondered if he'd finally let his instincts lead him astray. $25 was more than a month's wages. It was winter coming on, and he'd just spent nearly everything he had on land he'd never even seen. "Hey, Soggy," Chet called out, emboldened by the crowd's attention. "When you going to invite us all out to your estate? We could have us a swimming party in that swamp of yours." More laughter. Silas stood slowly, his joints protesting after a long day's ride. He was a tall man, lean as a whip, with the kind of quiet presence that could make a room settle down if he wanted it to. Right now, he didn't particularly want it to, but he was tired of being the evening's entertainment. "I expect I'll ride out there tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying across the room without being raised. "Have a look at what I bought. Any man who wants to come along is welcome. Might learn something about judging a thing before you've seen it proper." The laughter died down some, replaced by an uncertain quiet. Offering to take them along had been unexpected, and it shifted the game in a way that made the mockery feel a little cheap. "Hell, Soggy, I didn't mean nothing by it," Chet said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just having a bit of fun." "I know it," Silas said. He nodded to the bartender, a thick-shouldered man named Roy, who'd always treated him fair. "Put their next round on my tab. Consider it a celebration." He walked toward the door, and the room watched him go. Just as he reached the threshold, Roy called out, "Silas, you ain't got a tab here." "Then start one," Silas said without turning around. "I'm a landowner now. I reckon that's worth some credit." He stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the warmth and noise of the saloon. The street was quiet, just the distant sound of a piano from one of the other establishments, and the closer sound of horses shifting in their stalls at the livery. Above, the stars were beginning to show themselves, sharp and clear in the darkening sky. Silas pulled the deed from his pocket and unfolded it again. In the fading light, he could just make out the property description, beginning at the lone cottonwood on the north bank of Mosquito Creek, thence running east along said creek for approximately 1/2 mile, thence north to the base of the Red Bluff. thence west to the stand of willows, thence south to the point of beginning. He'd ridden past that country a few times over the years. It was low ground, fed by a creek that ran year-round, but never seemed to do much except breed mosquitoes and keep the ground soft. Useless land, most would say. The kind of place you rode through on your way to somewhere better. But Silas had noticed something in Cordell's eyes that afternoon, just for a moment when the money hit the desk. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of making a sale, but the satisfaction of getting rid of something troublesome. And that made Silas curious in a way he hadn't been curious about anything in years. He walked slowly toward the boarding house, where he kept a room when he wasn't working a ranch. Mrs. Henderson would have supper ready, and she'd ask him about his day, and he'd tell her he'd bought some land. She'd cluck her tongue and shake her head, but she'd be kind about it. That was her way. Tomorrow, he'd ride out to Mosquito Creek. He'd see this land that everyone found so amusing. And maybe, just maybe, he'd figure out why Thaddeus Cordell had been so eager to see it sold. The boarding house came into view, its windows glowing warm in the gathering dark. Silas climbed the steps, his boots heavy on the worn wood. Inside, he could hear Mrs. Henderson humming in the kitchen, the same hymn she always hummed while she cooked. It was a sound that spoke of continuity, of days that followed one after another in predictable patterns. But Silas had a feeling, just a whisper of intuition, really, that his predictable days were about to come to an end. For better or worse, that deed in his pocket had changed something. Not just in his circumstances, but in him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he'd reached out and grabbed hold of something. He'd made a choice that was his, and his alone. Whether it was the right choice remained to be seen. But as he stepped into the boarding house and smelled the pot roast Mrs. Henderson had prepared, Silas Bottoms allowed himself a small smile. He was a landowner now. That had to count for something. Even if all he owned was a swamp. The morning came cool and clear, the kind of autumn day that reminded a man why he'd chosen this hard country in the first place. Silas was in the saddle by first light, his horse, a dependable roan gelding named Ezra, moving at an easy walk through the outskirts of Redemption. He'd packed light, a canteen, some jerky, a rope, and the Winchester that had been his companion for more years than he cared to count. The ride to Mosquito Creek took the better part of 2 hours. The land gradually sloped downward as he travelled west, the dry grassland giving way to softer ground where willows clustered along the waterways. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and vegetation, and yes, the high whine of mosquitoes began to make itself known. Silas found the lone cottonwood mentioned in the deed, a massive old tree that stood like a sentinel on what must be the northern boundary of his property. Its leaves were turning gold, and they rustled in the light breeze with a sound like shuffling cards. He dismounted and tied Ezra to a low branch, then stood for a moment, taking in the lay of the land. Mosquito Creek was more than a creek. Here it had spread out into a series of shallow pools and channels that meandered through stands of cattails and sedge-grass. The water was dark, reflecting the sky like tarnished silver. In the distance, he could see the red bluff that marked another boundary, and beyond that, the higher ground where cattle country resumed. It was, he had to admit, exactly as worthless as everyone had said. The ground was too soft for building, too wet for crops, and no self-respecting cow would graze here when better grass stood a mile away. Even the wildlife seemed scarce, just some ducks paddling in the shallows and a heron standing motionless in the reeds. Silas was just beginning to question his decision-making when he heard the noise. It started as a distant braying, harsh and discordant, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large splashing in water. He moved toward the sound, his boots squelching in the mud, following the creek as it curved around a stand of willows. What he saw when he cleared the willows made him stop in his tracks. 2 donkeys, both jacks by the look of them, were engaged in a violent confrontation in the middle of the creek. They were wild, that much was clear from their shaggy coats and the way they moved with no trace of domestication. One was dark brown with a light-coloured muzzle, the other a dusty grey with black markings. They were up to their knees in the water, and they were trying their level best to kill each other. The grey donkey lunged forward, teeth bared, and clamped onto the brown one's neck. The brown one responded by wheeling around and delivering a kick that would have broken a man's ribs. They broke apart, circled, and came together again with a fury that seemed all out of proportion to whatever they might be fighting over. Silas had been around livestock his entire life, and he'd seen plenty of animals fight. Bulls fought for dominance. Stallions fought for mares. Dogs fought for territory. But there was something different about this confrontation. These donkeys weren't just fighting, they were desperate, almost frenzied in their violence. The brown donkey reared up and brought its front hooves down hard, churning the water where the grey had been standing. The grey wheeled and kicked backward, its hooves connecting with a meaty thud that made Silas wince. They separated again, both breathing hard, their sides heaving. Silas knew he should probably leave them to sort it out themselves. Wild donkeys were nothing to trifle with, and these two were clearly beyond reason. But something about the scene bothered him, a wrongness he couldn't quite name. They were fighting in the water, which seemed odd. Most animals would seek solid ground for a confrontation like this. He stepped forward, drawing the Winchester from his saddle scabbard, not to shoot, but to make noise. "Hey, get on out of there!" The donkeys' heads snapped toward him, ears forward. For a moment, they stood frozen, regarding him with that mix of wariness and stubbornness that was unique to their kind. Then the grey one brayed a sound like a rusty gate being forced open and bolted, splashing through the shallows toward the far bank. The brown one hesitated, looking between Silas and the departing grey, then followed, though with less urgency. It stopped once to look back, and Silas got the distinct impression it was considering whether to charge him instead. But then it turned and disappeared into the cattails, leaving only the sound of breaking vegetation in its wake. Silas stood at the edge of the creek, watching the ripples spread out from where the donkeys had been. The water was settling, the disturbed mud drifting back down to the bottom, except, he frowned, stepping closer. The water wasn't settling quite right. Where the donkeys had been fighting, where their hooves had churned up the creek bed, the water wasn't turning the reddish-brown of mud. It was swirling with something darker, thicker, with an iridescent sheen that caught the morning light. Silas waded into the creek, his boots filling with cold water. The bottom was soft, but not as soft as he'd expected, and as he moved toward the churned-up area, the smell hit him, a sharp, mineral odor that reminded him of coal oil, but heavier, more pungent. He knelt down in the knee-deep water and reached into the swirling darkness. His hand came up, coated with a thick, black substance that dripped between his fingers like molasses. It was warm, or at least warmer than the creek water, and it had a weight to it, a viscosity that was nothing like mud. For a long moment, Silas simply stared at his hand. His heart, which had been beating at its normal, steady pace, began to accelerate. His breath caught in his chest. He knew what this was. Any man who'd been paying attention to the newspapers over the past decade knew what this was. They'd discovered it in Pennsylvania, then Ohio, then Texas. Black gold, they called it. Crude oil. The stuff that fed lamps and locomotives and was making fortunes for men smart enough or lucky enough to find it. And here it was, seeping up through the bed of Mosquito Creek, right in the middle of the 20 acres he'd bought for $25. Silas stood slowly, his legs unsteady. The black substance was still swirling in the water where the donkeys had kicked it up. Now that he was looking for it, he could see other signs, a faint rainbow sheen on the surface of the water in places, dark patches along the bank where the oil had collected, even the smell in the air that he'd dismissed as marsh gas. The donkeys hadn't been fighting over a mate or territory. They'd been fighting over the one patch of water that wasn't contaminated with oil, the small area where the creek ran clearer, where the seepage wasn't as strong. They were thirsty, desperate for clean water to drink, and that desperation had driven them to violence. Silas looked down at his oil-covered hand, then at the creek, then at the surrounding land with new eyes. This wasn't worthless swampland. This was the surface of an oil field. The marsh conditions, the way nothing grew quite right here, the peculiar smell he'd noticed, it all made sense now. The oil had been seeping to the surface for who knew how long, probably for years, maybe decades. and Thaddeus Cordell had sold it to him for $25. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. Cordell knew. He had to have known. No man sold land that quickly, that easily, without knowing what he was getting rid of. But why? Why would Cordell, who was known for his sharp business sense, sell oil land for pocket change? Unless he'd acquired the land illegally, or unless there was some legal complication that made keeping it more trouble than it was worth. Or unless he simply needed to be rid of it before someone else discovered what lay beneath the surface. Silas's hand went to the deed in his vest pocket. The paper felt different now, heavier somehow, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. He owned this land. The deed was legal, signed and sealed. Whatever lay beneath the surface belonged to him. For the first time in his 53 years, Silas Bottoms owned something worth owning. But as he stood there in the creek, his boots full of water and his hand dripping with crude oil, a cold certainty settled over him. The moment Thaddeus Cordell realized what he'd done, or the moment he discovered that Silas had figured out what he'd bought, everything would change. A man like Cordell didn't let a fortune slip through his fingers without a fight. Silas waded back to shore, his mind racing. He needed to register the mineral rights. He needed to get to the county office and make sure his claim was ironclad. But more than that, he needed to be careful. Cordell had resources, connections, and a reputation for getting what he wanted by whatever means necessary. The sun was climbing higher now, warming the air, making the oil on his hand gleam in the light. Silas wiped it on a clump of grass, though the stain remained. He walked back to where Ezra stood, patiently waiting, untied the reins, and swung into the saddle. As he turned the horse back toward town, Silas took one last look at Mosquito Creek. It sat there innocent and quiet, giving no hint of the wealth that lay beneath its muddy surface. But Silas knew, and soon, whether he wanted it or not, others would know too. The ride back to redemption suddenly felt very different from the ride out. He was no longer a foolish cowboy inspecting his worthless purchase. He was a man with a secret, riding toward a confrontation he couldn't avoid. The fight was coming. The only question was, when? Silas rode straight through town without stopping, heading for the county office that sat on the edge of Redemption's main street. It was a squat adobe building that housed both the land registry and the sheriff's office, a combination that seemed either efficient or ominous, depending on your business there. He tied Ezra to the hitching post and climbed the steps, his oil-stained clothes drawing stares from a few passers-by. Let them stare. He had more pressing concerns. The land office was a cramped room filled with filing cabinets and the musty smell of old paper. Behind a desk sat Horace Trimble, the county clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who looked like he'd been born middle-aged. He glanced up as Silas entered, his nose wrinkling slightly at the petroleum smell. "Mr. Bottoms," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "What brings you here this morning?" "Need to register mineral rights on a property I just purchased," Silas said, pulling the deed from his pocket and laying it on the desk. "Mosquito Creek, Section 47. Horace picked up the deed with 2 fingers, holding it away from his body as if it might be contagious. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly, then looked up at Silas with an expression that might have been pity. "The Cordell property," he said. "Yes, I remember processing this sale yesterday. Mr. Bottoms, I feel obligated to tell you that registering mineral rights is a separate fee of $10, and frankly, given the nature of this land—" "I'll pay the fee," Silas interrupted. "I need it done today." Something in his voice made Horace pause. The clerk studied him for a moment, taking in the black stains on his hands and clothes, the set of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. A flicker of understanding crossed the clerk's face. "I see," Horace said quietly. He pulled out a thick ledger and opened it to a blank page. "I'll need your full legal name, the property description, and your signature. The filing will be official as of today's date." As Horace began the careful work of recording the claim, Silas felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. This was the first step, the most important one. Once the mineral rights were registered in his name, they couldn't be easily taken away. Not legally, anyway. "How long before this is official?" Silas asked. "It's official the moment I record it and stamp it," Horace said, not looking up from his careful handwriting. "But it takes about a week for the paperwork to make it to the territorial office. After that, it's on permanent record. A week. 7 days for word to spread, for complications to arise, for Thaddeus Cordell to realize what had happened." Silas pulled out $10, nearly half of what he had left, and placed it on the desk. Horace worked in silence for several minutes, filling out forms in triplicate, his pen scratching across the paper with methodical precision. Finally, he pulled out a heavy stamp, pressed it into an ink pad, and brought it down on each document with a decisive thunk. "Done," he said, sliding one copy across the desk to Silas. "Mineral rights to Section 47, Mosquito Creek property, registered to Silas Marcus Bottoms as of the 12th of October, 1893. Keep this copy in a safe place." Silas folded the document carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket alongside the deed. He had 2 pieces of paper now, both of them potentially worth more than he could imagine, both of them potentially worth dying for. "Horace," he said quietly, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention this filing to anyone just yet." Horace looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "County business is confidential unless there's legal cause to disclose it. You have my word, Mr. Bottoms, though I can't speak for whoever might be watching the registry books." It was a fair warning. The ledger was public record, available for anyone to inspect. If someone came looking, and someone would, they'd find the entry. But at least Horace wouldn't be volunteering the information. "Thank you," Silas said, and meant it. He stepped back out into the bright morning, his mind already moving to the next problem. He needed to keep the discovery quiet for as long as possible, but he also needed to make plans. Oil didn't develop itself. He'd need equipment, expertise, capital, things he didn't have and couldn't afford. But first, things first, he needed to clean up and think clearly. He headed toward the boarding house, his stomach reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday evening. Mrs. Henderson would have breakfast ready, and she'd cluck over the state of his clothes, and maybe in that ordinary moment he could figure out his next move. He was halfway to the boarding house when he saw the rider. The man was sitting on a horse in the middle of the street, not moving, just watching. He wore a long duster despite the warm morning, and his hat was pulled low enough to shadow his face. But there was something about the way he sat utterly still, utterly focused, that made the hair on the back of Silas's neck stand up. Silas kept walking, his hand drifting casually toward the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. The rider didn't move, but Silas could feel his eyes tracking every step. When Silas reached Ezra and began untying the reins, the rider finally stirred, turning his horse and moving off down the street at a walk. But not before Silas caught a glimpse of the rig. He wore a gun belt, with the holster tied down low, the mark of a man who made his living with his pistol. A hired gun. And in a town like Redemption, there was only one man who could afford to hire such men: Thaddeus Cordell. Silas climbed into the saddle, his earlier relief evaporating. He'd secured the mineral rights, yes, but he'd also just sent up a signal flare. The moment he'd walked into that land office smelling of crude oil, he'd announced his discovery to anyone paying attention. And apparently, someone had been paying very close attention indeed. He rode slowly toward the boarding house, his senses alert, his mind working through the implications. Cordell might not know for certain what Silas had found, but the banker was suspicious enough to have him watched. That meant Silas had even less time than he'd thought. As he dismounted in front of the boarding house, Silas made a decision. He couldn't develop this oil field alone, and he couldn't wait. He needed help, and he needed it from someone he could trust. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Thaddeus Cordell's money or his hired guns. The problem was, after 30 years of drifting from ranch to ranch, never putting down roots, never building lasting friendships, Silas wasn't sure he knew anyone who fit that description. But he was about to find out, because the alternative facing Cordell's hired guns alone wasn't just dangerous, it was suicide. He pushed open the door to the boarding house, the smell of bacon and coffee greeting him like an old friend. Mrs. Henderson appeared from the kitchen, took one look at his clothes, and threw her hands up in exasperation. "Silas Bottoms, "What in heaven's name have you been doing? You smell like a coal mine and look like you've been wrestling in a tar pit." "Something like that," Silas said, managing a tired smile. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you something. Who in this town do you trust? I mean really trust, with your life?" She stopped, mid-fuss, her sharp eyes studying his face. Whatever she saw there made her expression soften. "That's a serious question," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am, it is." She wiped her hands on her apron, thinking, "There's Sheriff Harding, but he's getting on in years and he's afraid of Cordell. There's Doc Morrison, solid as they come. And there's Jack Thornton owns the livery. He's honest as the day is long and twice as stubborn." "Jack Thornton," Silas repeated. He knew the man by sight, had stabled Ezra at his livery plenty of times. A big man, quiet, with hands that could handle a spooked horse or repair a broken wagon with equal skill. "But Silas," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dropping low, "whatever trouble you're in, be careful. This town isn't what it used to be, not since Cordell arrived." "I know," Silas said. "That's why I'm asking." He went to his room and changed into clean clothes, then splashed water on his face and hands, scrubbing away as much of the oil as he could. In the mirror, he looked like what he was, a tired cowboy who'd stumbled onto something bigger than himself. But there was something else in his reflection now, a determination he hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. He'd spent his whole life letting circumstances push him around, going wherever the work was, accepting whatever hand he was dealt. Not this time. This time, he was going to push back. Even if it killed him. Jack Thornton's livery stood at the far end of Main Street, a solid structure built from good lumber and honest labor. Silas could hear the ring of hammer on anvil before he even reached the open doors. Jack was at the forge, shaping a horseshoe with the kind of methodical precision that marked all his work. He was a bear of a man, 6 feet tall and broad across the shoulders, with forearms like fence posts and a beard that had gone grey at the edges. He looked up as Silas's shadow fell across the threshold, his blue eyes sharp despite his 50-some years. "Silas," he said, his voice a low rumble. He plunged the horseshoe into a bucket of water, sending up a hiss of steam. "Heard you bought yourself some land?" Word travels fast. In a town this size, everything travels fast. Jack set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Also heard you rode out there this morning and came back looking like you'd been dipped in tar. That true?" Silas glanced around the livery. It was empty except for a few horses in their stalls, but he lowered his voice anyway. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Jack studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Back room." The back room was where Jack kept his tack and tools, a cluttered space that smelled of leather and oil. Jack closed the door behind them and crossed his arms, waiting. Silas pulled out the deed and the mineral rights registration, laying them on the workbench. "I bought 20 acres on Mosquito Creek. Worthless swampland," everybody said. "But this morning I found crude oil seeping up through the creek bed, enough that I think there's a major deposit underneath." Jack picked up the papers, reading them slowly. His expression didn't change, but Silas saw his jaw tighten. "And Cordell sold you this land for $25. Yesterday afternoon." "He knew," Jack said flatly. "Cordell doesn't sneeze without calculating the profit in it. He knew what was under that land. That's what I figure. Question is, what's he going to do when he realizes I found it?" Jack handed the papers back and walked to the small window that looked out on the street. He stood there for a long moment, his back to Silas, his massive frame blocking most of the light. "I've known Thaddeus Cordell for 5 years, he said finally. "In that time, I've seen him foreclose on 4 properties, good properties owned by good people who hit a run of bad luck. I've seen him buy up water rights and then charge triple what they're worth. I've seen him smile while he ruins families." He turned to face Silas. "What I'm saying is, Cordell doesn't let go of money. If he thinks that oil belongs to him, he'll find a way to take it. The deed is legal. The mineral rights are registered. Legal doesn't matter much when the man you're up against owns the law." Jack saw Silas's expression and shook his head. "I'm not saying Sheriff Harding is corrupt. I'm saying he's old and tired and scared. Cordell has 3 hired guns in town right now, professional killers dressed up as bank security. You think Harding is going to stand between them and what Cordell wants? Silas had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel more real, more dangerous. So, what do I do? You leave, Jack said bluntly. Tonight. Take that deed and go to San Francisco or Denver or anywhere Cordell's reach doesn't extend. Sell the mineral rights to someone big enough to fight him, take your money, and start fresh somewhere else. It was sensible advice. Probably the smartest thing Silas could do. But even as Jack said it, Silas knew he wasn't going to take it. I spent 30 years running from one place to another, Silas said quietly. Never owned anything, never built anything, never stood my ground on anything that mattered. I'm tired of running, Jack. I'm tired of letting men like Cordell take what they want, because they can. Jack let out a long breath. You know what you're asking for? This isn't going to be a legal fight. Cordell will come at you with everything he has, and he has a lot. I know. You'll probably die. Probably. They looked at each other across the cluttered room, 2 men who'd spent their lives doing hard work in hard country. Jack's expression was unreadable, and for a moment Silas thought he'd pushed too hard, asked too much. Then Jack reached up and untied his apron, pulling it over his head and hanging it on a nail. Then I guess we'd better figure out how to keep you alive long enough to get that oil out of the ground. Relief flooded through Silas, so intense it made his knees weak. You're willing to help? Help. Jack barked a laugh. Silas, I've been waiting 5 years for someone in this town to stand up to Cordell. I'm not about to let you do it alone. He moved to a cabinet in the corner and pulled out a gun belt, checking the loads in a heavy revolver. But we're going to need more than just the 2 of us. We need Doc Morrison. He's steady, and he's got no love for Cordell after what happened with the Porter family. And we need information. We need to know exactly what Cordell is planning. How do we get that? Jack smiled, though there was no humor in it. Cordell's men drink at the Golden Spur every night. Men drink, they talk. We listen. Over the next hour, they made their plans. Jack would reach out to Doc Morrison quietly, feeling out whether the doctor would be willing to help. Silas would keep his head down and avoid drawing more attention, and tonight they'd start gathering information about Cordell's next move. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was a start. As they were finishing, they heard the sound of a horse pulling up outside. Jack moved to the window and looked out, his body going tense. Speak of the devil! Silas joined him at the window. Thaddeus Cordell was dismounting from a fine black gelding, his expensive suit somehow spotless despite the dusty street. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew he owned not just property, but people. Stay here, Jack said. Let me handle this. But Cordell wasn't coming to the livery. He stood in the street, looking directly at the building, and called out in a voice that carried clear across the distance. Mr. Bottoms, I know you're in there. I'd like a word, if you don't mind. Jack looked at Silas. Your call. Silas took a breath and stepped out of the back room, walking through the livery to stand in the doorway. Jack followed a step behind, his presence a solid reassurance. Mr. Cordell, Silas said evenly, what can I do for you? Cordell smiled that cold smile of his. I wanted to check on your satisfaction with yesterday's transaction. Sometimes buyers experience what we might call remorse after purchasing property. If you'd like to sell the land back to the bank, I'd be happy to offer you, say, $30, a $5 profit for 1 day's ownership. The land's not for sale. Ah, Cordell's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes. I see. Well, if you change your mind, the offer stands. For now. He started to turn away, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Bottoms? You should know that I take a personal interest in all developments in this area. All developments. I'd hate for you to make any hasty decisions without proper guidance. I'll keep that in mind, Silas said. Cordell tipped his hat, climbed back on his horse, and rode away at a leisurely pace. But the threat had been clear enough. Cordell knew, maybe not all the details, but he knew something had changed, and he was moving to secure his position. Jack came to stand beside Silas, watching Cordell's retreating figure. No, Silas agreed. It didn't. You still want to do this? Silas thought about the oil seeping up through Mosquito Creek. He thought about 30 years of having nothing, being nothing, drifting through life like smoke on the wind. He thought about his sister and her children, struggling to survive on a failing farm. He thought about all the people in this town who'd been crushed under Cordell's heel because no one had the courage to stop him. "Yes," he said, "I still want to do this." Jack nodded slowly, as if Silas had just answered a question far bigger than the one he'd asked. "Then we'd better get ready, because that man isn't going to wait long before he makes his move." Through the window, Silas could see two of Cordell's hired guns watching the livery from across the street. The siege had already begun, and this time there was nowhere to run. Doc Morrison lived above his practice in a set of modest rooms that smelled of carbolic acid and peppermint. He answered the door that evening, still wearing his shirt sleeves, a surgical text open on the table behind him. He was a slight man in his late 40s, with careful hands and eyes that missed very little. "Silas," he said, surprise evident in his voice, "and Jack, this must be quite the social call to bring you both to my door after dark." "We need to talk," Jack said, glancing down the empty street. "Inside, if you don't mind." Doc Morrison stepped aside, ushering them in and closing the door firmly. He gestured them to chairs around his small dining table and sat down himself, folding his hands and waiting. Silas told him everything: the land purchase, the discovery of the oil, Cordell's threatening visit. Doc listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Silas finished, the doctor sat back and removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly with his handkerchief. "You're asking me to stand against Thaddeus Cordell," he said finally. "A man who controls most of the money in this town, who has the sheriff in his pocket, and who employs men who kill for a living." "Yes," Silas said simply. "That's what I'm asking." Doc Morrison replaced his spectacles and looked at each of them in turn. "The Porter family," he said quietly. 2 years ago, Daniel Porter borrowed money from Cordell to expand his ranch. When cattle prices fell and he couldn't make the payment, Cordell foreclosed. It was legal, technically, but Daniel Porter had 3 daughters and a wife who depended on that land. He paused, his jaw working. Daniel put a gun in his mouth rather than watch his family turned out. I was the one who had to tell his wife and daughters what happened. The room fell silent. Silas had heard rumors about the Porter tragedy, but he hadn't known the details, hadn't known Doc Morrison's connection to it. "I swore then that if I ever had a chance to stop Cordell, I would take it," Doc continued. "I didn't expect that chance to come in the form of a cowboy and a crude oil seep, but I'll be damned if I let it pass by." He stood up and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a worn gun belt. "So yes, Silas, I'm with you, whatever comes." Relief washed over Silas again, though it was tempered by the knowledge of what he was asking these men to risk. "Thank you," he said, "both of you." "Thank us when we're still alive to hear it," Doc said dryly. "Now, what's the plan?" They spent the next 2 hours working through the details. Jack had already done some reconnaissance. Cordell had 4 hired guns in town now, not 3. 2 of them were watching the boarding house where Silas stayed. 1 was camped near the land office, and the 4th seemed to rotate between various strategic locations. "He's building a net," Jack said, drawing a rough map on a piece of paper, "making sure you can't move without him knowing about it. Question is, when does he pull it tight?" "Soon," Doc said. "Cordell isn't a patient man when money is involved. He'll want to settle this before word spreads beyond redemption. Right now, it's containable. Give it a week, and someone will ask questions he doesn't want asked. Which means he'll either try to buy me out or force me out," Silas said. "And since I've already refused to sell, that leaves force." "What kind of force?" Jack asked. Doc leaned forward. "My guess? He'll manufacture a legal pretext, find some clause in the deed, some error in the filing, some technicality that lets him claim the property is still his. He'll have Sheriff Harding serve the papers, backed by his hired guns in case there's resistance." It made sense. Cordell was ruthless, but he was also careful. He'd want the appearance of legality, even if the substance was fraud. That way, if questions were asked later, he could point to documents and procedures and claim everything was done properly. "So we need to make sure the documentation is bulletproof," Silas said. "And we need witnesses, people who can testify that the sale was legitimate if it ever comes to court." "Horace Trimble saw the whole transaction," Jack pointed out. "He's the county clerk. His testimony would carry weight." "If he's willing to give it," Doc said. "Horace is a good man, but he's got a wife and children. Cordell could make his life very difficult." They talked through various scenarios, each one more dangerous than the last. The oil field represented a fortune, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Men had killed for far less. The fact that Cordell hadn't simply sent his hired guns to eliminate Silas already suggested he was trying to do this cleanly, with a veneer of legality. But that restraint wouldn't last forever. "We need leverage," Silas said finally. "Something that makes it more dangerous for Cordell to come after us than to leave us alone." "Like what?" Jack asked. Silas thought about it, turning the problem over in his mind. Cordell's power came from his control of information and his willingness to use violence. If they could threaten that control, expose him publicly, make it costly to attack them. "The newspapers," he said. "If we can get the story to a big paper, Denver, San Francisco, make it public that there's oil on my land and that Cordell is trying to steal it, he'll have to back off. He can't afford that kind of attention." Doc nodded slowly. "It's risky. The moment we go public, we tip our hand completely. Cordell will know we're serious about fighting him." "He already knows that," Jack said. "The question is whether we can get the information out before he stops us." "I can ride to Denver," Silas offered. "It's a 4-day trip. I could be there and back in a week." "You'd never make it out of town," Doc said bluntly. "Cordell's men are watching you constantly. The moment you try to leave, they'll follow. And on the open road, without witnesses, anything could happen. You might have an unfortunate accident, fall from your horse, get thrown by a spooked animal. These things happen to cowboys all the time." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken violence. Silas knew Doc was right. Cordell wouldn't let him simply ride away with information that could destroy everything the banker had worked for. "Then we send someone else," Jack said. "Someone Cordell isn't watching. Someone who can get to Denver and back without raising suspicion." "Who?" Silas asked. Before anyone could answer, they heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere below, followed by the acrid smell of smoke. Doc was on his feet instantly, running for the door. Silas and Jack followed, their boots pounding down the narrow staircase. The front window of Doc's practice had been shattered, and flames were already licking up the curtains, fed by what looked like a bottle of lamp oil. The examination room was beginning to fill with smoke. "Water!" Doc shouted, grabbing a bucket from the corner. Jack found another, and they worked frantically to douse the flames before they could spread to the wooden walls. Silas grabbed blankets and beat at the base of the fire, his eyes streaming from the smoke. It took 10 minutes of desperate effort, but they managed to contain the blaze before it could engulf the building. When the last flames were out, they stood in the ruined examination room, breathing hard, covered in soot and sweat. Through the broken window, Silas could see a figure watching from across the street, one of Cordell's hired guns, making no effort to hide. The man touched the brim of his hat in a mock salute, then turned and walked away into the darkness. "So much for legal proceedings," Jack said grimly. Doc surveyed the damage to his practice, the scorched walls, the broken window, the examination table covered in ash and water. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. "He just declared war." "No," Silas said quietly, watching the hired gun disappear around a corner. "He's warning us what war will look like if we don't surrender. This is his way of saying, the offer is still on the table, sell the land back, walk away, and this all stops." "And if we don't?" Doc asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Silas looked at his two allies, these good men who'd agreed to stand with him even though they owed him nothing. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. One word from him, and they could all walk away. Doc could rebuild his practice, Jack could go back to his livery, and Silas could sell the deed for $30 and ride out of town with his life. But then he thought about Daniel Porter, who died rather than lose his land. He thought about all the other families Cordell had ruined, all the other lives he'd crushed in pursuit of profit. He thought about his sister and her children, and about the possibility, slim but real, that this oil field could change everything. "If we don't," Silas said, "then we fight, and we make damn sure that if we go down, we take him with us." Doc and Jack exchanged glances, then nodded. "All right then," Jack said. "Let's figure out how to fight a war we can't afford to lose." Outside, the night had grown cold. Somewhere in the darkness, Cordell's hired guns were watching and waiting. The siege continued, and everyone knew it was only going to get worse before it got better. If it got better at all. The next morning brought a cold rain that turned the streets of Redemption into rivers of mud. Silas watched from his window at the boarding house as Cordell's men maintained their vigil despite the weather. They stood in doorways and under awnings, patient as vultures, waiting for something to happen. Mrs. Henderson brought him breakfast on a tray she'd insisted after seeing the burns on his hands from fighting the fire at Doc's place. "You're not going out there today," she said firmly, setting down the tray with eggs and biscuits. "Those men mean you harm, Silas. Anyone with eyes can see it." "I can't hide in here forever." "No," she agreed, "but you can be smart about when and where you show yourself." She sat down in the chair by the door, her hands folded in her lap. "I knew your mother, you know, back in '67 before you moved west. She was a fine woman, strong as oak, and twice as stubborn." Silas looked up in surprise. "I didn't know that. You were just a boy then, maybe 8 or 9. Your father had died in the war, and your mother was trying to keep the farm going by herself. I helped her with the harvest that year." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were distant, remembering. She used to say that a person's true measure wasn't in what they accumulated, but in what they were willing to stand for. "Looks like you inherited that from her." The words settled into Silas like stones into still water, creating ripples he couldn't quite name. He'd spent so many years running from commitment, from responsibility, from anything that might tie him down. Now here he was, standing his ground for the first time in his adult life, and it turned out he was just following a lesson his mother had taught him 40 years ago. "Thank you for telling me that," he said quietly. Mrs. Henderson stood and smoothed her apron. "Your mother would be proud of you. Whatever happens, remember that." She left before he could respond, closing the door softly behind her. Silas ate his breakfast slowly, thinking about his mother, about all the years he'd wasted, about whether it was possible to make up for lost time. The rain continued to fall, steady and cold, washing away the dust, but revealing the mud beneath. Around noon, Jack arrived with Doc Morrison. They were both soaked through despite their oilcloth coats, and they brought news that made the weather seem warm by comparison. "Cordell filed a lawsuit this morning," Doc said, shaking water from his hat, "claiming the original sale was made under duress and that you took advantage of a clerical error in the deed description. He's asking a judge to void the sale and return the property to the bank." Silas felt his stomach drop. "He can try," Jack said. "Whether it'll work is another question. But here's the real problem. The judge hearing the case is Samuel Blackwood. He's been on Cordell's payroll for 3 years, handling his legal affairs. This isn't a trial, it's a stage play with a predetermined ending. When's the hearing?" "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp." Doc pulled out a soggy newspaper and laid it on the table. "But there's more." Cordell took out an advertisement in the Redemption Gazette. "He's offering a reward, $100 for information about illegal activities related to the Mosquito Creek property. He's trying to manufacture evidence of wrongdoing." Silas read the advertisement, his jaw tightening with each word. Cordell was being clever about it. He wasn't accusing Silas of anything specific, just casting a wide net and seeing what he could catch. In a town where $100 was 3 months' wages for most people, someone would be tempted to come forward with something, even if they had to make it up. "He's poisoning the well," Silas said, "making sure that even if we win in court, which we won't, the town will think I'm a criminal." "Exactly," Doc agreed. "He's not just trying to take the land, he's trying to destroy your credibility so thoroughly that no one will believe you, even if you manage to expose him." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the windows. Silas felt the walls closing in, Cordell's hired guns outside, a corrupt judge waiting to rule against him. the court of public opinion being turned before he could even present his case. Every move he made seemed to strengthen Cordell's position. "We need to change the game," he said finally. "Stop reacting and start acting." "I'm listening," Jack said. Silas stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street. Through the rain, he could see one of Cordell's men huddled in a doorway, miserable but committed to his watch. Cordell thinks he knows how this plays out. He files his lawsuit, the judge rules in his favor, and I either accept the ruling or his hired guns make sure I can't cause trouble. It's worked for him before. "So what do we do different?" Doc asked. "We go public," Silas said, turning to face them. "Not in Denver, not through newspapers that might take weeks to print our story. Right here, right now, in Redemption. We tell everyone in town what's really happening. We show them the oil. We explain that Cordell sold me that land knowing what was under it, and now he's trying to steal it back using a corrupt judge and hired killers." Jack frowned. "That's dangerous. Once we reveal the oil, Cordell has no reason to keep pretending this is legal. He'll come at us directly." "He's already coming at us directly," Silas pointed out. "He burned Doc's practice last night. How much more direct can he get?" "He has a point," Doc said slowly. "And if we're going to go down anyway, we might as well go down fighting in the open. At least that way there's a chance the truth survives, even if we don't." "There's another benefit," Silas continued, his mind working through the possibilities. "If the whole town knows about the oil, it becomes harder for Cordell to make us disappear. Right now, we're just 3 men, nobody important. But if we become a public story, if people are watching to see what happens, he has to be more careful." Jack stood and joined him at the window. "When?" "Tonight, at the Golden Spur. Everyone goes there on Saturday night. We make our stand in front of the whole town, and we dare Cordell to do something about it with witnesses watching." "He will do something about it," Doc said quietly. "You know that, right? This isn't going to scare him off. It's going to force his hand." "I know," Silas said. "But at least it'll be on our terms." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Jack went back to his livery to gather supplies, rope, lanterns, and the oil-stained clothes Silas had worn when he discovered the seep. Doc wrote out a statement describing the oil field in technical terms, something that could be shown to potential investors or newspapers. And Silas rehearsed what he would say, trying to find words that would make people understand what was at stake. As evening approached and the rain finally stopped, Mrs. Henderson brought them dinner. She didn't ask what they were planning, but Silas could see in her eyes that she knew it was something significant. Before she left, she squeezed his shoulder in a gesture that reminded him painfully of his mother. "Be careful," was all she said. At 7 o'clock, they stepped out into the muddy street. Cordell's men straightened up when they saw them, hands drifting toward their guns. But Silas and his companions weren't trying to sneak away or hide. They walked openly down the center of the street toward the Golden Spur, 3 men who decided that dying on their feet was better than living on their knees. The saloon was crowded, as Silas had expected. Cowboys, miners, merchants, and drifters, all packed into the warm interior, seeking escape from the cold and wet. Conversation died as Silas entered, followed by Jack and Doc. Everyone knew something was happening. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Silas walked to the center of the room and climbed onto a chair so everyone could see him. His heart was pounding, his mouth dry, but his voice came out steady and clear. "I have something to say," he announced. "Something every person in this room needs to hear. It's about Thaddeus Cordell, about the land I bought, and about what's really happening in this town." In the back corner, Silas could see 2 of Cordell's hired guns. They were watching him with cold eyes, their hands resting on their gun belts, but they didn't move, not yet. Whatever orders Cordell had given them, apparently they didn't include shooting a man in front of 50 witnesses. 3 days ago," Silas continued, "I bought 20 acres on Mosquito Creek for $25. Everyone laughed, said I'd been swindled, said the land was worthless." He paused, letting the familiar story sink in. They were wrong. That land sits on top of a crude oil deposit. Black gold, enough to make a fortune. And Thaddeus Cordell knew it when he sold it to me. A murmur ran through the crowd. People exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock to anger. Silas pressed on. Now Cordell wants it back. He's filed a fraudulent lawsuit. He's hired guns to intimidate me. Last night, he had someone torch Doc Morrison's practice as a warning. He looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. This isn't just about me and my land. It's about whether we're going to let one man control this town through fear and violence. It's about whether the law means anything, or whether it's just whatever Cordell says it is. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the piano player had stopped. Every eye in the room was either on Silas or on Cordell's hired guns, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, from the doorway, a voice rang out clear and sharp. "That's quite an accusation, Mr. Bottoms." Thaddeus Cordell stepped into the saloon, flanked by 2 more hired guns. His suit was immaculate despite the mud outside, and his face wore that familiar cold smile. "Perhaps," he said, moving through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea, "you'd like to present your evidence to support such claims." The confrontation everyone had been dreading was finally here, and there was nowhere left to run. Silas stood on the chair, looking down at Thaddeus Cordell, and felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes watching the confrontation. This was the moment that would determine everything, whether he lived or died, whether the truth mattered, or whether power was the only truth that counted. "Evidence," Silas said calmly. "I have the deed. I have the mineral rights registration. And I have this." He pulled out the oil-stained shirt he'd worn 3 days ago, holding it up so everyone could see the dark stains. "Crude oil from Mosquito Creek. Anyone who wants to ride out there can see it for themselves. It's seeping up through the creek bed, plain as day." Cordell's smile never wavered. A shirt with stains on it. How compelling. "Tell me, did you perhaps manufacture this evidence after the fact? Perhaps by purchasing some lamp oil and—" "It ain't lamp oil," called out a voice from the back. An old prospector named Gus stepped forward, squinting at the shirt. "I worked the Pennsylvania oil fields in '72. That's crude, sure as I'm standing here. You can smell it from across the room." Several other men moved closer, examining the shirt, sniffing the air. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Cordell's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure. "Very well," he said smoothly. "Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that there is indeed oil on the Mosquito Creek property. That hardly proves I knew about it when I sold the land. I acquired that property through a loan default. I had no reason to investigate its mineral potential. I simply wanted to recover my losses." "Then why are you trying so hard to get it back?" Jack Thornton asked, stepping forward. "Why file a lawsuit? Why hire 4 armed men to watch Silas day and night? If you didn't know about the oil, why do you care so much?" "I care," Cordell said coldly, "because Mr. Bottoms is making slanderous accusations about my character and my business practices. I care because he's spreading lies that could damage my reputation and my bank. I have every right to protect myself from defamation." It was well played, Silas had to admit. Cordell was pivoting from defense to offense, making himself the victim. And it was working. He could see some of the crowd's sympathy shifting, particularly among the merchants who depended on Cordell's bank for loans. "What about the fire at Doc Morrison's practice?" Silas pressed. "Was that protecting your reputation too?" "What fire?" Cordell asked, his eyebrows raised in apparent surprise. "Dr. Morrison. Has something happened to your practice? This is the first I'm hearing of it. If one of my employees was involved, I certainly hope you've reported it to Sheriff Harding so the matter can be properly investigated." The performance was masterful. Cordell had just established plausible deniability in front of the entire town. If anyone accused his men of arson, he could claim complete ignorance. And without direct proof linking him to the fire, it would be his word against Silas's. Silas felt the situation slipping away from him. Everything he'd said was true. But Cordell was better at this game, better at manipulating people, better at using words as weapons, better at appearing reasonable while being ruthless. Then a new voice cut through the tension, reedy and uncertain. He knew. Everyone turned. Horace Trimble, the county clerk, stood in the doorway. His face was pale and his hands were shaking, but his voice grew stronger as he stepped into the room. "Cordell knew about the oil. I can prove it." The saloon went deathly quiet. Cordell's mask of pleasant reasonableness finally cracked, his expression hardening into something dangerous. "Mr. Trimble, I strongly advise you to think carefully before you speak." "I've done nothing but think for the past 3 days," Horace said, his voice trembling but determined. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "This is a geological survey of the Mosquito Creek property commissioned by Thaddeus Cordell 6 months ago. It clearly identifies the presence of crude oil seepage and estimates the field's potential value at over $200,000. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Horace held up the document so everyone could see it official-looking, with maps and technical language and Cordell's signature at the bottom. Cordell knew exactly what that land was worth. Horace continued, gaining confidence with each word. He acquired it through a fraudulent loan. The previous owner never actually defaulted. Cordell simply claimed he had and foreclosed before the man could prove otherwise. Then Cordell sat on the property for 6 months, trying to figure out how to develop it without drawing attention. When Silas came in offering to buy it, Cordell saw an opportunity. He could sell the land for pennies, make it look like a legitimate transaction, and then later claim Silas had defrauded him somehow. That way, Cordell gets the oil field back while appearing to be the victim. Cordell's face had gone white, then red. "You're a liar," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That document is a forgery. I'll have you arrested for—" "It's not a forgery," Horace interrupted. "I filed it myself when you commissioned the survey. It's in the county records, available for anyone to review. You just didn't think anyone would ever connect it to the sale because you processed the deed under a different property description. But I checked the survey boundaries against the deed Silas filed. They're identical. Same land, same section, same creek." The room erupted in angry voices. People were shouting questions, accusations, demands for explanations. Cordell's hired guns moved closer to their employer, their hands on their weapons, clearly uncertain about what to do in the face of such public exposure. Silas climbed down from his chair, his legs weak with relief and vindication. Horace Trimble, the quiet county clerk who'd processed his paperwork 3 days ago, had just saved his life. Maybe saved all their lives. "Why?" Silas asked, moving close enough that Horace could hear him over the din. "Why did you come forward? Cordell could destroy you." Horace looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and stayed silent too long. "Because I have a daughter. She's 7 years old. And I don't want her growing up in a town where men like Cordell can do whatever they want without consequences. I don't want her to think that's how the world has to be." Before Silas could respond, Cordell's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Enough." The room fell silent again. Cordell stood in the center of the saloon, surrounded by his hired guns, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The veneer of civilization had finally stripped away, revealing the ruthless core beneath. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice cold as winter ice. "That land is mine, by right of investment, by right of development, by right of the capital I'm willing to put into extracting that oil. What's a cowboy going to do with an oil field? You don't have the money, the equipment, or the expertise to develop it. You'll waste it. You'll squander a fortune because you're too ignorant and too poor to do anything else." "Maybe," Silas said quietly, "but it's mine to waste. The deed is legal, the mineral rights are registered, and now everyone in this room knows the truth about how you operate." "The truth?" Cordell laughed. But there was no humor in it. "The truth is that might makes right. The truth is that this town needs my bank, my capital, my connections. You think these people will side with you over me? You think they'll risk their livelihoods, their businesses, their futures for the sake of one old cowboy's pride?" He looked around the room, his gaze challenging everyone present. "I'm offering one final opportunity for sanity to prevail. Silas, sell me the land for a fair price, let's say $500. Walk away with more money than you've ever had in your life. Everyone goes home happy, and we forget this unpleasantness ever happened." The offer hung in the air, tempting and dangerous. $500 was a fortune to most of the people in the room. It would solve Silas's immediate problems, would let him help his sister, would set him up for his remaining years. But it would also mean surrender. It would mean Cordell had won, that power and intimidation and corruption were stronger than the law, stronger than what was right. Silas looked at Doc Morrison, who'd lost his practice defending the truth, at Jack Thornton, who'd put his livelihood at risk by standing with him, at Horace Trimble, who'd just destroyed his relationship with the most powerful man in town for the sake of his daughter's future, at Mrs. Henderson, standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes. "No," Silas said simply. "The land stays mine." Cordell's face went completely blank, as if he couldn't quite process what he'd just heard. Then something shifted in his expression, a calculation, a decision, a choice to stop pretending. "Then you've made your choice," Cordell said softly. He turned to his hired guns. "Gentlemen, it appears we have a—" "That's enough, Thaddeus." The new voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a tall man in a U.S. Marshal's badge standing there, flanked by two deputies. The Marshal was in his 50s, with grey at his temples, and the kind of hard eyes that came from seeing too much of humanity's worst. "Marshal Briggs," Cordell said, his tone shifting instantly to warm surprise. "What brings you to redemption?" "A complaint filed in Denver 3 days ago," Briggs said, stepping into the room. His deputies moved to cover the exits, their rifles held ready. "Seems someone sent word that Thaddeus Cordell was operating an illegal land fraud scheme. The territorial governor takes a dim view of such activities, particularly when they involve potential oil fields. Thought I'd come investigate personally." Silas's head spun. Someone had filed a complaint in Denver 3 days ago, but none of them had sent word anywhere. They hadn't had time. Then he looked at Horace Trimble and saw the faint smile on the clerk's face. The geological survey hadn't been Horace's only secret. He'd been planning this for longer than any of them had known. "That complaint is clearly fraudulent," Cordell said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "A vindictive attempt to— We'll sort out what's fraudulent and what isn't," Marshal Briggs interrupted. "In the meantime, I'm placing you under arrest pending investigation. Your men can either surrender their weapons peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. Their choice." For a long moment, the hired guns looked at Cordell, waiting for orders. Then, one by one, they unbuckled their gun belts and laid them on the nearest table. They were professionals, and professionals knew when the game was over. Cordell's face had gone ashen. "You can't do this. I have rights, I have lawyers, and you'll have every opportunity to exercise those rights," Briggs said, "after we've had a good long chat about your business practices." He nodded to his deputies, who moved forward with handcuffs. As they led Cordell toward the door, the banker turned back one last time, his eyes finding Silas in the crowd. The hatred in that gaze was almost physical in its intensity. "This isn't over," Cordell said quietly. "Yes," Silas replied, "it is." But even as he said it, even as he watched Cordell being led away into the night, Silas knew it wasn't quite true. The immediate danger had passed, but the aftermath would be complicated. There would be legal proceedings, territorial investigations, questions about the oil field's ownership and development. Still, as the crowd in the saloon began to cheer, as Jack and Doc moved to congratulate him, as Horace Trimble stood quietly in the corner looking like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, Silas allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The days following Cordell's arrest passed in a blur of activity that left Silas feeling both exhausted and strangely energized. Marshal Briggs had set up a temporary office in Redemption, conducting interviews and gathering evidence. Horace Trimble spent hours providing documentation and testimony about Cordell's various schemes over the past 5 years. The list of victims was longer than anyone had suspected. But even with Cordell in custody, nothing was certain. The banker had posted bail within 24 hours, his connections ran deep, apparently all the way to the territorial capital, and was now staying at the Grand Hotel with his lawyers, preparing his defense. The trial was set for 3 weeks out, time enough for both sides to marshal their forces. Silas sat in Jack's livery on a cold morning exactly 1 week after the confrontation at the Golden Spur. Doc Morrison was there, along with Horace Trimble and a new arrival, a man named Benjamin Fletcher, who'd come down from Denver, representing a consortium of oil investors. Fletcher was in his 30s, sharp-eyed and well-dressed, with the kind of energy that marked men who saw opportunity in every direction. "The geology report is solid," Fletcher said, spreading maps and documents across Jack's workbench. "If the seepage is as significant as you've described, we're looking at a field that could produce for decades. My consortium is prepared to offer you a development contract. We provide all the capital, equipment and expertise in exchange for a 60-40 split. 60 for us, 40 for you." "That seems fair," Silas said, though in truth he had no idea what was fair in the oil business. The numbers Fletcher was suggesting made his head spin. 40% of potential earnings that could run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. "However," Fletcher continued, his expression growing serious, "there's a complication. The legal situation with Cordell. Until that's resolved definitively, we can't move forward. Our investors won't commit capital to a property with clouded title, no matter how promising the geology." "The trial is in 3 weeks," Doc pointed out. "Once Cordell is convicted of fraud, the title will be clear." Fletcher shook his head. "It's not that simple. Even if Cordell is convicted, he still has grounds for appeal. That could take months, even years. And there's another problem. Cordell's been putting out his own story. He's claiming he was entrapped, that Silas and Horace conspired to defraud him. He's got affidavits from witnesses who say they saw Silas doctoring the oil evidence. It's all lies, obviously, but mud sticks." "So what do we do?" Jack asked. "We need to prove beyond any doubt that the oil field exists and that Silas's claim is legitimate," Fletcher said. "And we need to do it publicly, in a way that can't be disputed or muddied by Cordell's lawyers. I'm suggesting we conduct a formal drilling operation, bring in professional engineers, document everything meticulously. That way, when the trial happens, we have concrete evidence that settles the matter once and for all." "How long would that take?" Silas asked. 2 weeks if we move fast. My consortium can have equipment here in 3 days. We drill a test well, analyze the results, file official reports with the Territorial Mining Office. It's ironclad. And expensive," Horace added quietly. "Who pays for all this?" Fletcher smiled. "We do. Consider it an investment in our future partnership. If the well comes in as expected, we proceed with full development. If not well, that's the risk of the oil business." It sounded reasonable, almost too reasonable. Silas studied Fletcher carefully, trying to read the man beyond his confident words. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Fletcher said. "But I'll be honest with you, speed matters here. Every day we delay is a day Cordell's lawyers can work on dismantling your case. And there's something else you should know." He pulled out a newspaper from his satchel, the Denver Post, dated 3 days earlier. The headline read, "Oil boom comes to Colorado. Territorial governor calls for investigation of land claims." "This story has gotten bigger than redemption," Fletcher said. "There are now 6 investors circling this situation, all trying to figure out how to get a piece of it. Some of them aren't as ethical as my consortium. If Cordell doesn't get you, someone else might try." The words hung heavy in the air. Silas had been so focused on the immediate threat of Cordell that he hadn't considered the broader implications. He'd stumbled onto something that attracted predators the way blood attracted sharks. "Then we drill," Silas said decisively. "The sooner we prove what's there, the sooner we can lock this down legally." Fletcher nodded approvingly. "Smart man. I'll send word to Denver today. Equipment and crew should arrive by Friday. In the meantime, I'd suggest you make your property as secure as possible. I don't put anything past Cordell at this point." After Fletcher left to send his telegrams, the 4 men sat in the quiet of the livery, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the afternoon sun was struggling to break through autumn clouds. Winter was coming, and with it, the sense that time was running short. "I never wanted any of this," Silas said finally. "A week ago, all I wanted was a piece of land I could call mine, something to leave behind that mattered. Now I'm caught up in territorial politics, oil speculation, and the kind of money that makes men do terrible things." "You can still walk away," Jack said quietly. Sell the claim to Fletcher's consortium, take a payout, and disappear somewhere Cordell can't find you. Could I, though? Silas looked at his friend. Really, walk away, knowing what I know now, knowing how many people Cordell has hurt, how many more he'll hurt if he gets away with this. No, Doc said, answering for Jack. You couldn't. None of us could. That's why we're here. Horace, who'd been silent through most of the conversation, spoke up in his quiet way. I've been thinking about something. Cordell posted bail, $100,000. That's an enormous sum, even for him. Someone backed that bail, someone with deep pockets and a strong interest in seeing Cordell go free. Any idea who? Silas asked. I've been doing some research. Turns out Cordell has connections to a man named Augustus Fairchild. He's a Denver financier, owns stakes in mining operations throughout the territory. He's also known for his, let's call them, creative interpretations of property law. You think Fairchild is behind Cordell? Doc asked. I think Fairchild sees an opportunity, Horace said. If Cordell goes down, the bank becomes vulnerable. Fairchild could buy it for pennies on the dollar, along with all of Cordell's other holdings. He gets richer, Cordell takes the fall, and no one looks too closely at Fairchild's own questionable dealings. So we're not just fighting Cordell, Jack said slowly. We're fighting the entire corrupt system he's part of. Which is exactly why we need that drilling operation, Silas said. It's not enough to prove Cordell is corrupt. We need to prove the oil field is real and valuable enough that no judge or financier can make it disappear. We need to make this so public, so well documented, that any attempt to steal it becomes too risky. Over the next few days, Silas threw himself into preparation with an intensity that surprised even him. He rode out to Mosquito Creek each morning, surveying the land, mapping the areas where the oil seepage was strongest, planning where the drill site should go. He met with Fletcher's engineers when they arrived, answering their technical questions as best he could. He consulted with Doc about safety procedures and with Jack about security arrangements. The work was exhausting but also strangely satisfying. For the first time in his life, Silas was building something, creating something that would outlast him. It wasn't just about the money, though he couldn't deny that the potential wealth was life-changing. It was about proving that a man could still matter, that his choices could still make a difference, even when powerful forces wanted him to disappear. At night, when he lay in his room at the boarding house, Silas often thought about the two wild donkeys he'd seen fighting over clean water. They'd been desperate, driven by basic need, unable to understand that their struggle was taking place on top of a fortune. In a way, he'd been like those donkeys for most of his life, fighting for survival without seeing the larger possibilities beneath his feet. But he saw them now, and he wasn't going to let go. On Thursday afternoon, the drilling equipment arrived. 3 massive wagons pulled by teams of oxen, carrying machinery that looked like instruments of torture designed by an engineer with a grudge against the earth. Fletcher's crew, 6 men, all experienced in oil extraction, set up camp near the creek, and by Friday morning they were ready to begin. Silas stood at the edge of the property, watching the crew assemble the drilling rig. Jack was beside him, and Doc, and Horace. Mrs. Henderson had even ridden out, bringing food and coffee for the workers. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered too, drawn by curiosity and the sense that something important was happening. Whatever they find down there, Jack said quietly, it's going to change everything. You ready for that? Silas thought about it, really thought about it. Change had always frightened him before, which was why he'd spent 30 years drifting, avoiding commitment, refusing to put down roots. But standing here now, watching the drill prepare to pierce the earth, he felt something different. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of resigned acceptance. The change was coming whether he was ready or not. No, he said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. Fletcher appeared at his elbow, clipboard in hand. We're ready to start. You want to give the order? Silas looked at the assembled crowd, at the drilling rig standing stark against the autumn sky, at the creek where 2 donkeys had fought over clean water and accidentally revealed a fortune. He thought about his mother, about the lessons she'd taught him about standing for something. He thought about all the years he'd wasted being afraid. "Start drilling," he said. The machinery roared to life, and the bit began to turn, biting into the earth with a shriek of metal against stone. The crowd fell silent, watching as the drill descended, foot by foot, into the unknown. Somewhere in town, Thaddeus Cordell was planning his counterattack. Somewhere in Denver, Augustus Fairchild was calculating his profits. And somewhere beneath their feet, oil was waiting to be found or not. But for now, in this moment, Silas allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt since he was young. He felt alive. The drill bit struck oil at 43 feet. It happened on the second day of drilling, just after dawn, when the crew was preparing for another shift. One moment the rig was grinding steadily through rock and clay. The next moment it broke through into a pocket of pressurized crude. Oil shot up through the drill pipe with explosive force, spraying 20 feet into the air before the crew could engage the shut-off valves. Silas stood 50 feet away, covered head to toe in black crude, unable to wipe the grin from his face. The oil had hit him square in the chest, soaking his clothes, filling his boots, and he'd never felt better in his life. Fletcher was shouting orders to his crew, trying to contain the flow, but he was grinning too. "That's a gusher," Fletcher yelled over the roar of escaping oil. A genuine, honest-to-God gusher. The crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers. People were clapping, hugging each other, dancing in the mud. Even Doc Morrison, normally so reserved, was laughing like a schoolboy. Jack Thornton had tears streaming down his face, and he made no effort to hide them. But Silas's attention was drawn away from the celebration by movement on the ridge above the property. 3 riders had appeared, silhouetted against the rising sun. Even at this distance, he recognized the central figure Thaddeus Cordell, watching the oil spray into the air with an expression that might have been carved from stone. "Jack," Silas said quietly, touching his friend's arm. "We've got company." Jack followed his gaze and went still. The celebration around them continued, but the 2 men stood frozen, watching Cordell and his companions. After a moment, the banker turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge. "He saw it," Jack said. "He saw proof that you were telling the truth." "Which means he knows his legal case just got a lot harder to win," Doc added, joining them. The doctor's expression had lost all trace of celebration. A desperate man is a dangerous man. Fletcher managed to get the well under control within the hour, installing a temporary cap that reduced the flow to a manageable stream into collection barrels. The oil was coming up thick and dark, of excellent quality according to Fletcher's preliminary assessment. His estimate of the field's value kept climbing 200,000, 300,000, maybe more, depending on how deep and wide the deposit ran. "This is life-changing money," Fletcher said, wiping oil from his hands with a rag. "For everyone involved, my consortium will want to move immediately on full development. We're talking dozens of wells, a refinery, storage facilities, pipeline connections to the railroad. This area could become an industrial center." "How soon can you begin?" Silas asked. "Soon as the legal situation is settled. I'll be filing all the necessary reports with the territorial office today. Geological surveys, production estimates, official documentation of the strike. This goes on record as one of the significant oil discoveries in Colorado history." Fletcher paused, his expression growing serious. "But Silas, you need to understand something. The moment these reports are filed, this stops being a local dispute. You're going to have attention from people and organizations you can't even imagine right now. Some will want to buy you out, some will want to partner with you, and some will want to take it by force if they think they can get away with it." "I understand," Silas said, though he wondered if he truly did. The scale of what was happening kept expanding beyond his ability to fully grasp it. The celebration at the drill site continued through the morning, but Silas found his attention repeatedly drawn to the ridge where Cordell had appeared. Something about the banker's stillness, his silent observation of the oil strike, bothered him. Cordell should have been angry, desperate, making threats. Instead, he'd simply watched and left. Around noon, a rider came galloping into the camp, one of Jack's apprentices from the livery, his face flushed with urgency. "Mr. Bottoms, Sheriff Harding needs you back in town. He says it's important." "What's happened?" Silas asked. "Don't know, sir. He just said to fetch you quick." Silas exchanged glances with Jack and Doc. "Could be a trap," Jack said quietly. "Could be," Silas agreed. "But we can't ignore it either." They rode back to Redemption together, all three of them armed and alert. The town seemed unusually quiet when they arrived, with fewer people on the streets than normal. Sheriff Harding was waiting on the steps of his office, looking older and more tired than Silas had ever seen him. "Silas," the sheriff said heavily, "we need to talk, privately." They followed him inside, where Marshal Briggs was also waiting. The marshal's expression was grave, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of bad news. "Thaddeus Cordell is dead," Briggs said flatly. "Shot twice in the chest at his hotel room approximately 2 hours ago. The killer left through the window and hasn't been found." He paused, his eyes fixed on Silas. "The murder weapon was a Winchester rifle, same model you carry, and 3 witnesses have come forward, claiming they saw you near the hotel around the time of the shooting." The room spun. Silas grabbed the edge of the desk to steady himself. "That's impossible. I was at the drill site all morning. Fletcher and his crew can verify that, along with half the town." "I believe you," Briggs said, "but someone's gone to a lot of trouble to make it look like you killed Cordell. And until we sort this out, I'm afraid I have to place you under arrest." Outside the window, Silas could see people gathering in the street. Their faces a mixture of shock and suspicion. In the span of 2 hours, he'd gone from vindication to accused murderer. The trap had been sprung, and he'd walked right into it. The jail cell was small and cold, with a narrow cot and a single barred window that let in the afternoon light. Silas sat on the cot, his mind racing through the implications of what had happened. Someone had murdered Cordell and framed him for it, but who? And more importantly, why? Jack and Doc were allowed to visit him an hour after his arrest. Marshal Briggs supervised the meeting, standing just outside the cell, but within earshot. "The witnesses are all known associates of Cordell," Jack said quietly. "Men who owed him money or favors. Their testimony is questionable at best. But it's enough to hold you pending investigation," Doc added. "And that's the real problem. While you're locked up, you can't protect your interests. Someone could move against your property, challenge your claim, even forge documents transferring ownership." Silas understood what they weren't saying directly. With Cordell dead and Silas in jail, the oil field was vulnerable. Whoever had orchestrated this was positioning themselves to seize the property in the chaos. "Augustus Fairchild," Silas said suddenly. "The Denver financier Horace mentioned. He had the most to gain from getting both me and Cordell out of the way." Marshal Briggs stepped closer to the bars. "Just logic," Silas said. "Cordell was Fairchild's competition. I'm the legal owner. With both of us gone, Fairchild can swoop in and claim the field through whatever legal machinations he's already prepared." "I'll look into it," Briggs said. "But I need more than speculation. I need proof." Horace Trimble appeared in the doorway of the sheriff's office, breathing hard as if he'd been running. "Marshal, I found something." He held up a document covered in official seals. "This is a deed transfer filed this morning at the county office. It claims Silas sold the Mosquito Creek property to the Fairchild Development Company for $1, signed and notarized 3 days ago." "That's a forgery," Silas said immediately. "I never signed any such document." "I know it is," Horace said. "Because I was the notary supposedly present at the signing, and I was in Denver 3 days ago testifying to the Territorial Commission. I have hotel receipts and witness statements proving it. But whoever forged this was counting on it going unnoticed in the confusion after Cordell's murder." Marshal Briggs took the document, examining it carefully. "This is sophisticated, professional forgers' work, the kind of resources that suggest serious money behind it." "Fairchild," Jack said. "Has to be." "I agree," Briggs said. "But here's the problem, even with this forgery. I still have witnesses placing Silas at the scene of Cordell's murder. Until I can break their testimony or find the actual killer, my hands are tied." They stood in frustrated silence, the walls of the legal trap closing in around them. Then a new voice spoke from the doorway, female, clear, and utterly unexpected. "Perhaps I can help with that." Everyone turned. A woman stood in the entrance to the sheriff's office, elegantly dressed in traveling clothes, with dark hair pinned up under a fashionable hat. She was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of composure that came from wealth and education. "Mrs. Cordell," Marshal Briggs said, surprise evident in his voice, "I didn't know you'd arrived in Redemption." "I took the first train from Santa Fe when I received word of my husband's death," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "And I have information that I believe will be relevant to your investigation." She stepped into the office, and Silas could see now that she carried a leather portfolio. She opened it and extracted several papers, laying them on the sheriff's desk with precise movements. "My husband kept meticulous records of all his business dealings," she said, "including his arrangement with Augustus Fairchild. They were partners in a scheme to monopolize oil rights throughout the territory. Cordell was supposed to acquire properties through fraud and foreclosure, then transfer them to Fairchild at predetermined prices. Fairchild would develop them, and they would split the profits." Marshal Briggs picked up the papers, reading quickly. His expression grew darker with each page. "These are contracts, signed agreements, financial transfers. This is evidence of a criminal conspiracy." "Yes, Mrs. Cordell said, "and there's more. My husband became concerned recently that Fairchild intended to betray him, to eliminate him, and take everything. He began documenting Fairchild's activities as insurance. This portfolio contains evidence of bribes paid to judges, hired killings disguised as accidents, systematic fraud across 3 territories." She paused, her composure finally cracking slightly. "My husband was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He knew Fairchild would eventually come for him. He just didn't expect it to happen so soon." "Why come forward with this?" Silas asked from his cell. "You could have disappeared with this evidence, used it for your own purposes." Mrs. Cordell looked at him for the first time, her eyes clear and direct. "Because my husband's death doesn't change what he did to people in this town. The Porters, the Hendersons, dozens of others who lost everything. I can't undo that. But I can make sure the man who orchestrated all of it doesn't profit from my husband's death." She turned back to Briggs. "Will this evidence be sufficient to shift your investigation?" "More than sufficient," Briggs said grimly. He turned to his deputies. "Send word to Denver. I want Augustus Fairchild brought in for questioning immediately. And find those witnesses. I want to know exactly how much Fairchild paid them to lie." Within minutes, the office was chaos of activity. Telegrams were sent, deputies dispatched, warrants prepared. Through it all, Silas sat in his cell, watching the machinery of justice finally turn in the right direction. 2 hours later, Marshal Briggs unlocked the cell door. "You're free to go, Mr. Bottoms. The witnesses have recanted their testimony. Turned out they were each paid $500 to place you at the scene. And we've received word that Fairchild was attempting to board a train to San Francisco. He's been detained." Silas stepped out of the cell, his legs unsteady. Jack and Doc were waiting, and they clasped his arms in silent support. Mrs. Cordell stood near the window, looking out at the street. "Thank you," Silas said to her. "You didn't have to do this." She turned, and he saw tears in her eyes for the first time. "Yes, I did. My husband's sins were his own, but I won't profit from them, and I won't let his partner destroy more lives." She gathered her portfolio and moved toward the door. "The oil field is yours, Mr. Bottoms. Use it better than he would have." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of lavender and the weight of unexpected grace. 3 months later, Silas stood at the edge of Mosquito Creek and watched the sun set over his oil field. 7 drilling rigs now operated across the property, their rhythmic pumping a constant heartbeat that echoed across the valley. Storage tanks gleamed in the fading light, and a new spur of railroad track ran right up to the collection facility. Fletcher's consortium had moved with impressive speed once the legal complications were resolved. The landscape had changed dramatically, and so had Redemption. The town's population had doubled as workers, and their families arrived seeking employment. New businesses had opened, a proper hotel, 2 more general stores, a bank that wasn't owned by corrupt financiers. The money flowing from the oil field was transforming the entire region. But some things remained the same. Jack Thornton still ran his livery, though he'd expanded it to handle the increased traffic. Doc Morrison had rebuilt his practice, this time with proper equipment funded by a generous donation from an anonymous benefactor. Horace Trimble still clerked at the county office, though he walked a little taller these days, his daughter playing in a town that felt safer than it had in years. Silas heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Mrs. Henderson approaching, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. She'd insisted on walking out to check on him, claiming she wanted to see what all the fuss was about, but Silas suspected she simply wanted to make sure he was doing all right. "It's loud," she observed, gesturing at the drilling rigs, "and it smells peculiar, but I suppose that's the smell of progress." "Or money," Silas said with a slight smile. "Hard to tell the difference sometimes." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the machinery work. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Your mother would be proud, you know. Not of the money, she never cared much about that, but of the way you stood your ground, the way you helped change this town." "I didn't do it alone," Silas said. "Without Jack, Doc, Horace, you, without all of you, I'd be dead, and Cordell or Fairchild would own this land." "True enough," she agreed. "But you were the one who started it. You were the one who looked at worthless swampland and saw possibility. That takes a particular kind of vision." Silas thought about that. He'd never considered himself a visionary. He was just a cowboy who'd gotten lucky, who'd stumbled onto something valuable through sheer accident. But maybe there was more to it than luck. Maybe part of seeing possibility was being willing to take a chance when everyone else said you were a fool. "I sent money to my sister," he said. $5,000, enough to save the farm and then some. She wrote back asking if I'd robbed a bank. Mrs. Henderson laughed. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that I'd bought swampland and found oil." "I don't think she believed me." "Will you go see her, now that you can afford to travel?" Silas considered it. He could travel anywhere now, could go anywhere, do anything. The 40% share of the oil field's profits was already more money than he'd ever imagined having. Fletcher was talking about expansion, about acquiring adjacent properties, about building an empire. The opportunities were limitless. But standing here, looking out over the land he'd fought for, Silas found he didn't want to go anywhere. For the first time in his life, he'd put down roots. He had a place that mattered, people who depended on him, a future that extended beyond the next paycheck. "Maybe in the spring," he said, "after the initial development is complete. Right now, I need to be here." Movement from the direction of town caught his attention. A rider was approaching Jack by the silhouette. He pulled up beside them, swinging down from his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Got news," Jack said. "Augustus Fairchild was convicted this afternoon. 20 years in territorial prison. They're also going after all his business partners and associates. Turns out his corruption went even deeper than we thought." "And the oil rights?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Territorial Commission had ruled definitively on the matter weeks ago. Confirmed as yours in perpetuity, free and clear of any claims or encumbrances. It's official, it's recorded, and it's unassailable." Jack grinned. "You're a wealthy man, Silas Bottoms. How does it feel?" Silas thought about the question seriously. He thought about the two wild donkeys fighting over clean water, about the mistakes and chances and choices that had led him here. He thought about Cordell and Fairchild, and all the people who'd tried to take what wasn't theirs. He thought about his mother's lessons, and 30 years of drifting, and the weight of finally standing still. "It feels strange," he said honestly. "Like I'm wearing someone else's clothes, but also right, somehow. Like maybe this is what I was supposed to find all along." Doc Morrison appeared from the direction of the drilling camp, drawn by the gathering. Behind him came Horace Trimble, walking with his young daughter on his shoulders. Fletcher was there too, along with several of the crew chiefs. It wasn't planned, this gathering at sunset, but it felt natural. These were the people who'd stood together when it mattered, who'd risked everything for what was right. As the sun finally slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Silas looked around at the faces of his friends. Not people he'd known for decades, but people who'd become essential in just a few short weeks. That was something money couldn't buy, the knowledge that you'd stood with good people in a hard time and none of you had broken. I've been thinking, he said slowly, the idea forming even as he spoke, about what to do with this oil field. Fletcher's consortium gets their 40%, that's contracted, but my share, I want to use part of it to establish a fund for people in Redemption and the surrounding area who need help. Loans for farmers who hit hard times, money for widows and orphans, a school maybe, and a proper hospital for Doc. The others looked at him in surprise. Fletcher recovered first, a smile spreading across his face. That's generous, Silas. Very generous. It's not generosity, Silas said. It's remembering where I came from, remembering what it's like to have nothing and no way to get more. If this oil field is going to change Redemption, I want it to be a change that helps everyone, not just me. Mrs. Henderson squeezed his arm, tears shining in her eyes. Jack nodded slowly, his expression approving. Doc and Horace exchanged glances, then smiled. And Horace's daughter, understanding nothing of the adult conversation but sensing something important, laughed and clapped her hands. The oil rigs continued their rhythmic pumping, drawing wealth from beneath the earth. But standing there with his friends as darkness settled over the valley, Silas understood that the real treasure wasn't the oil. It was this, the community, the connections, the sense of purpose that came from using what you had to make things better. He'd started this journey as Silas Soggy Bottoms, the laughingstock who'd bought worthless Swampland for $25. He ended it as something different, not rich, exactly, though he was that too. He ended it as someone who mattered, who'd made a difference, who'd stood his ground when it would have been easier to run. That, more than any amount of oil money, was worth everything. As they walked back toward town together, talking and laughing in the gathering darkness, Silas took one last look at the oil field. Those 2 donkeys were long gone, driven away by all the human activity. He hoped they'd found clean water somewhere safer. In a way, they'd started all of this 2 desperate animals fighting over survival, unknowingly revealing a fortune. Sometimes the biggest discoveries came from the smallest moments. Sometimes worthless Swampland turned out to be exactly what you needed. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the mistakes you made turned out to be the best decisions of your life. Silas smiled to himself and kept walking, following his friends toward the lights of Redemption. Behind him, the oil rigs pumped on through the night, steady and sure, like a heartbeat that would echo for decades to come.